How do you ensure that your training zones are set up properly for your current fitness, thresholds, and ability? How do you know when you had a good field test? And what are some of the best pro tips out there to make sure that your zones and FTP are indeed accurate? Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Today, we'll build off of last week's discussion where I went over some common field testing procedures and how to use them to establish FTP and threshold heart rate. If you missed that one, be sure to go back and listen to it. This episode will explain how to take that information and customize it to your current physiology and get you training right. I'll answer all of these questions and more today, but first, let me recap one thing. Field test pacing. I went over general pacing guidelines in last week's episode, but the crucial part is making sure that you don't blow up or finish too strong on your field test. In other words, you want an evenly paced, hard effort to achieve your best and highest average power, heart rate, and effort in these field tests, like the 20-minute test developed by Andy Coggan or the 2x8 time trial field test developed by Chris Carmichael and the team at CTS, or some of those power duration testing procedures that we do in model-based approaches. If you do a ramp test, pacing isn't as important, but it's kind of baked into the test itself. It's both a pro and a con. Again, I cover all of this last week and much more. So be sure to listen to that if you haven't already. But here's a couple kind of juicy pro tips, if you will, that I didn't cover in detail last week, but it applies today when it comes to ensuring that you had a good field test. So a couple examples of maybe when you didn't have a good field test. That's probably a good way to describe knowing when you had a good one or not. So first one, if your power spiked up hard at the very front end and then fell off on the back end of the effort, no matter how long that duration is, but just kind of like this implosion and the power just drastically goes down and you blew up, simply do the test again when you're fresh and you evenly pace for the given effort. Okay. Now, if you started a little lighter and you finished super strong in that final, minute or two with like a big power spike up at the very end, simply do the test again when you're fresh and you want to pace more evenly throughout. Pacing is key here. Okay. You should start pretty much any field test at that 9 to 10 out of 10 and finish at a 10 out of 10. If 10 is a max effort, right? That's the scale that I use, scale of 1 to 10. 1 being super light, 10 being max effort. Now, for sprints in anything less than a minute, which, in most field testing, you won't encounter too much. But if you do power profile testing or power duration testing in model-based approaches, you'll have some sprints like 10, 20, and 60-second efforts. So if it's less than a minute, there's not much pacing that goes on. Simply go full tilt, full gas. Don't worry about pacing. But for the longer power durations, like the 20 minutes, the 8 minutes, and maybe even a 3 minute, there's pacing to it. Get good at pacing and you'll get good at testing. Then you'll get good results. Now, let's assume I drilled that into your head enough and you paced well over the duration, you gave a max effort. It's time to calculate your thresholds and set up your training zones. Okay. I went into some pretty good detail about this and how the goal of really any good field test out there is to get you a threshold power and a threshold heart rate that you can use and apply to really any method out there. So in setting up your training zones, you use that FTP and threshold heart rate from the cycling field test. You plug it into the training zone calculator on Training Peaks or whatever platform you're using. And so long as the platform, even things like Wahoo and Zwift and intervals.icu, if they're calling for some sort of threshold to generate zones, use FTP, use your highest average heart rate from the 20-minute test, use 93% of the percentage of the highest average heart rate from the CTS test. Again, all those little details were all last week. Okay. But you want to use those thresholds, plug it in, calculate, and voila, you have training zones. Okay. Here's a couple pro tips on your training zones. For power, round your zones to the nearest 5. Why? Because, as I've said in this podcast before, human physiology is not as precise or accurate as the devices that we're using to measure it, i.e. power meters. So what I tend to find is when I round off to the nearest 5, it's 5 and 0 at the end. So 286 would go to 290, for example, and 311 would go to 310. I tend to find that myself, as well as my athletes, have an easier time remembering their training zones when I round to that nearest 5. It's just much easier to remember. And the goal really of the training that I prescribe and deploy to my athletes is to get them to look at that title of the workout and get familiar with their training zones and look at, say, like a 3x10 threshold and 90-minute total ride time. What I want them to do is be able to know their zone 4 or their threshold zones over time, because it's not going to change once we get it established, especially like over the course of an 8-week training blockers or something like that. You get comfortable with it, you remember it, you go out, you do it, boom, super easy, super effective. Now with heart rate zones, it's a little different. You want to keep those pretty, when you calculate them, you don't want to round off on that. Heart rate, it's a little bit tighter on that. So plug those in, calculate them, good to go. Most on the upper end for the heart rate zones, most will just automatically put it at 255. What I would do is I'd look at the maximum heart rate that you've achieved over the past 90 days or maybe a year. And I would just put my max heart rate in for that upper end there, because 250, I mean, no one's going to be hitting 255 and be around to talk about it afterwards. So for the heart rate zones, don't need to round up, but for the max heart rate, you can just put that a little bit more accurate to yourself. And then you have good, accurate, and also realistically deployable and memorable zones when you're out there training. So hope that helps on the pro tip on zones. Now, let's talk about ensuring that the training zones that you get from your field test are actually realistic and doable. We want to make sure that they're achievable with your current fitness, your current physiology. And, you know, the best way I can describe this is I use something called a verification workout, or sometimes verification workouts. Okay, so multiple workouts to kind of suss this out. Now, if you were to give me like just one workout to ensure that the field test and the numbers and the training zones are set accurately, I would tell you that the key workout I use is a 4x10 minutes at threshold, 91 to 105% of your FTP. And the reason I use a workout like this is it's testing zone 4 and it's testing the aerobic glycolytic energy system. More on that in a minute, but if we can suss out any issues on that system, which is the system that we use the most for training, racing, riding, and all things bikes, if we can verify that, everything else takes care of itself. Okay. So my workout is warm up and then get into 4x10 minutes at threshold. Like I said before, 91 to 105% of FTP. You want to take 5 minutes recovery in between. I tell my athlete to aim for the middle of the power range. So right around, call it 100% of FTP. Okay. And simply record the power, record the heart rate, record the cadence. Okay. And they choose their own cadence, by the way. I'm not prescribing any of that too. And I tell them that I want you to tell me the rate of perceived effort. Okay. So I'm not prescribing an RPE on this. Keep in mind, I use a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a maximum effort, 1 being super light effort. So I make sure to give them that scale and calibrate our brains accordingly to that. And I don't tell them the RPE because I want to observe. I just want them to hit the power number, okay, to verify the data. And then we observe heart rate, we observe cadence, and we observe perceived effort. Record it afterwards. And then for the perceived effort, I tell them we either talk right on the phone, or better yet, you put it in the comment section on Training Peaks so that we have that data for, future and retroactively use. Okay. Now in general, here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for power in zone on each of the 4 intervals. I'm looking for heart rate in zone on each of the 4 intervals at zone 4 threshold. RPE, Generally, I want threshold to be around 7 or 8 out of 10. Okay. But I encourage the athlete to go in open-minded and just record whatever you feel. Okay. Think about that. And and sometimes people just write it down after they get done with their effort. So it's like written down right away, unfiltered during the workout itself. Okay. If you're doing this inside, for example, or put it in your brain notes when you're out there on the road. So if we hit these three parameters, power's in zone, heart rate's in zone, and RPE is between 7 and 8. I would say zones are calculated appropriately, and we're G to G for training. If one or more of these are off, we can adjust training zones slightly to get you training right without having to do another field test again. Because if you're like many of my athletes, you don't enjoy field testing, maybe a lot of anxiety. You don't want to, go eyes bleeding on a multiple basis. Okay. No one that I have met really enjoys field testing. However, there's a time place to test again to verify ranges if you really have to. Okay. So let's not talk about testing again. Let's talk about how to adjust. Here's a couple scenarios that I would typically see in my athletes and when people are asking me questions about doing a verification workout like this. So the first scenario is they couldn't hit the power. Okay. One classic example is not being able to hit the minimum power. So we're talking about 91% of that threshold at FTP. Okay. And you can't hit the minimum for any of the intervals, but typically maybe the final two intervals. Okay. Now the power may just be, dipping on the third and fourth, and the heart rate remains high, or perhaps it's even creeping up into zone 5. Okay. Likely rate of perceived effort is also high, going from 7 to 8 on the first one to 8, almost 9 on the second one, and maybe like 8 to 9 on the third, 9, maybe 10. You basically and genuinely you're on the struggle bus is what that means. And if that's the case, here's the pro tips. Simply lower the power by about 10 watts across all zones. Just lower it down and then round it off again to the nearest 5. And then you want to repeat this workout again in 2 to 3 days when you're fresh and ready for it. And what I'm guessing is that all the stars will align. The holy trinity of exercise monitoring will align. The perceived effort will be between 7 and 8. Power will be in the zone. Heart rate will be in zone again for zone 4. So that's the first scenario if you can't hit the power numbers. Second scenario is heart rate is going too high. Let's say you hit all the power numbers. Okay, your time in zone at the minimum or middle, whatever, but you're in zone for the power. However, the heart rate is on the higher side of zone 4, or it's going again up into zone 5. This could be for a number of different reasons. And remember, heart rate, it has the highest variability of any of the 3 metrics that we're talking about here, power, heart rate being the other 2. So if heart rate is high for the given effort relative to power, here's some pro coach tips. Look at where you rode the power at. Is it on the high side of the power zone, or is it on the low side of the power zone? If it's on the high side, makes sense that heart rate would be high. Okay, more on that in a second. But if it's on the low side for power, check perceived effort. If that too is high, 8 or 9, then you want to definitely adjust the power down 5 to 10 watts. If you're on the low side of the power and the heart rate is going much higher, like into zone 5 and more, okay, like we're talking about, you want to adjust the power down at least 10 watts, maybe 15, again, across the board for every zone. And that will set you up for better success. So if that heart rate is high and the power is low, definitely adjust the zones. If you're on the high side of the power and the heart rate is high, not drastically high, what I would do is probably stay the course and just hang out on the low end of the power zones, whatever zones that you're going to be doing in your upcoming training, because you probably just need some conditioning. You probably just need training, aerobic development. Okay. And the heart rate's going to come down over time. So if that power and heart rate is high, probably don't need to adjust too much, but I would definitely suggest pacing lower on the lower end of all training zones until that heart rate comes down within zone and the perceived effort ticks down a little bit. One quick note here on perceived effort. I've talked about it quite a bit in using it as a metric to monitor exercise intensity. But man, be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself of how things feel. RPE is subjective. It's based on your perceived effort. Don't lie to yourself or your coach on what it felt like just to try to prove that you're tough or better than you are. Or worse, I suppose the whole point in testing and verifying these tests is to get as close as accurate to where you're at, like currently with your physiology and fitness, to train properly. Falsifying the records does nothing for you. It does nothing for your coach other than make them frustrated. Now, if you coach yourself or you use some AI program, this is probably even worse because all that false feedback is going into an echo chamber of sorts, and stuff can get off the tracks pretty quickly in a bad way. So, RPE is an excellent measuring tool so long as you're honest with yourself and the scale is calibrated properly. Let me say this again. Scale of 1 to 10, that's what I use. 1 is super, super light. 10 is a maximum effort. Okay. There are other scales out there, like scale of 1 to 5, 5 being a max effort, 1 being lightest. Okay. But everything kind of gets a little tighter in there. I find that my athletes really enjoy a scale of 1 to 10. Training Peaks uses a scale of 1 to 10. Many systems use a scale of 1 to 10. There's the Borg heart rate scale. It's a little bit out of date in my opinion. I generally find that scale 1 to 10 is pretty simple, pretty universal, and I don't really care what you use so long as there's some perceived effort scale out there and you and your AI program or you and your coach or whoever's involved is talking the same language and everybody's calibrated on effort. My best coaching tip here is start ranking all of your intervals and rides on RPE and do it separately. Okay. Either in your head or on Training Peaks or however you organize your training. What this means is separate your intervals from the total ride itself. Your intervals could be, say, these threshold intervals. They could be at an 8 out of 10. But with warm-up and recovery periods and maybe some endurance afterwards, maybe the full day feels more like a 6. Okay. But the efforts themselves felt like an 8. Think about this. If you do 2 max efforts on a 3-hour ride, max efforts, so they were at a 10 out of 10, but you did a 3-hour ride and it was like a chill, like easy zone 2 ride, the aggregate perceived stress shouldn't be a 10, even though you did some efforts at 10. Okay. It's going to be, it's going to be higher than maybe 3 or 4 where you were riding throughout, but those max efforts, it's going to change stresses, right? So you have to be able to identify that as a rider when you're out there doing your efforts. So again, my advice is to get really good at perceived effort, and the whole process of practicing ranking your perceived efforts will get really good when it comes down to doing efforts, doing testing, racing, and all these things. Okay, just start thinking more about your effort, record intervals and total ride time separately, and you'll start to increase the accuracy of your interval pacing gauge. Okay, let me get off my soapbox there on perceived effort. Okay, but it brings me to my third kind of scenario here where rate of perceived effort is too high. So let's say that you're hitting all the power in zones, but you're kind of hanging out at the minimum, call it 91% of FTP. Heart rate's high, but on average, it's still coming out to that zone 4 threshold. When you look at the heart rate and you're analyzing the power and the heart rate itself, perhaps the heart rate puts a toe or two into zone 5, but nothing crazy, no huge spikes. However, perceived effort, if you're honest with yourself, is that it has that 8 going on 9 for each one. My pro tip here, lower your power zones 5 to 10 on all zones across the board, no matter what training is going to do in the future, and just hang out on the low end of the power zones, wait for the perceived effort to align with power and heart rate, and you'll have a ton of success. Couple final points here. It all starts with good pacing on a field test. Listen to last week's pod if you hadn't already, and please understand that pacing is a skill. It's an art and important aspect of becoming an athlete. Cyclists, runners, swimmers, triathletes, really any sport have some sort of pacing to it, especially in cycling. Get good at pacing and you'll get good at bikes. And to get good at pacing, you'll need to get good at honestly ranking your rate of perceived effort across all efforts. I'll leave it there on that. Now, using a workout like this verification workout that I described, 4x10, it stresses and strains the aerobic glycolytic energy system. And in my opinion, that's the best system, and that's the best way to tease out these proper zones. This is the primary energy system that we use across all training, racing, and everything else, like I talked about before. Some key aspects here is you want the total time of whatever this verification test or process should be. You want the total work time in zone of 30 to 60 minutes at threshold. Now, it's kind of a long time scale, okay? And I usually choose that 4x10 for many athletes. But let me give you some guidelines on how to scale this down and scale it up. All right. So for beginners, and this would be somebody who's new to cycling, maybe training 3 years and less, and you're still kind of like new, okay? 4x8 minutes at threshold, 91 to 105%, with 4 to 5 minute recovery in between. That's what I would use if you're a little bit more green, okay? 4x10 minutes with 5 minute recovery in between. That's what I would use for the majority of people probably listening to this podcast. They're intermediates, they're masters athletes. You've been training for, 3 to 5, maybe a little bit longer years. Okay. But you know what you're doing. You're crunched on time, 4x10 with 5 in between, warm up and cool down. You can still get that done in 60 to 75 minutes. Okay. And it's going to be pressing on that gas pedal enough in the aerobic glycolytic energy system to get us the data that we need. Now, for advanced riders, elites, and pros, I'll generally use 3x20 minutes with maybe 6 to 10 minute recovery in between. I'm going to look at perceived effort, power, time and zone, heart rate, time and zone, all these things. Okay. But use these workouts to help scale up or down for your verification workout accordingly based on your training experience and your fitness level. When in doubt, this is probably the most important part of the podcast. When in doubt, lower your zones by 5 to 10 watts. If you're going to err, it is far better to err on the side of less, intensity, so that you don't overdo it. And overdoing it means too much stress, and you're overstressing all the energy systems, you're overstressing yourself cognitively. Overdoing intensity will not give you better results. Typically, it's going to do the opposite. And it's super frustrating when you're the athlete trying to do the training and you're overdoing the intensity. It completely sucks, and it will usually end in a nose dive crash to the ground. You can always test again in 6 to 8 weeks of training, if you think that you need to up the zones a little bit. But if you go through a verification workout and one of those aspects are off, and you're like, man, I don't know if this is my FTP, just lower it 5 to 10 watts, do training, test again in 6 to 8 weeks. That's it. Super simple. And that's it. That's it. That's our show for today. I hope you all got something out of it. And if you did, please share it with a friend. That's the best way to help grow the show and ensure that you keep on getting good advice from sources like this. Plus, you're helping your training partner get better. If anyone listening today has a question on all things endurance training related, please head over to trainright.com/podcast. Click on Ask a Training Question. Fill that form out and send it over to me and my team at CTS, and we'll do our best to answer it on a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to come back next week to get more actionable training advice.